The Mi-17 transport helicopter descended to the abandoned helipad through sheets of thin snow that threatened to envelop the landscape. This was not safe weather for travel, but the pilot and helicopter occupants knew there was no choice. To not follow orders was a more dangerous prospect than crashing into the mountainside, although only just. In an emergency such as this, everyone was considered expendable. The pilot knew that his life meant nothing to those cowering back in Moscow. Meters from the ground, the aging helicopter hovered briefly as if reconsidering its actions, only to land harshly, the pilot cursing his lack of control. He wasn't himself, fear threatening to grip him, his co-pilot similarly ashen-faced. This was not the kind of duty either of them had signed up for. If he had been given a choice, he would have told those who had commanded he fly to this remote location to go to hell. The pilot was not like the violent men his helicopter carried. Behind him in the passenger section, 5 heavily armed soldiers unloaded themselves and their equipment from the transport, with not a word said to those who had delivered them to this desecrated place. The pilot was happy with that. These men, these killers, they were not someone he wanted to have anything to do with if such could be avoided. Being only a pilot, he knew nothing about the cataclysmic events that had occurred at this location. But the fact he was ferrying this team on such short notice, in this weather, meant that it must have been bad, the worst. Not a place someone with 2 young sons to raise wanted to be anywhere near. The men his helicopter brought were known amongst the vodka-infused chatter of his fellow pilots. Wherever they went, death was never far behind. The pilot cursed under his breath for being cursed with this mission. The pilot glanced, looked behind him, the last of the soldiers stepping from the helicopter. There was the blissful sound of the side door closing, a figure stepping into view so he could be seen from the cockpit window. This man, that many would call killer in frightened tones, motioned up into the sky with his thumb. Time to get the hell out of here, thought the pilot. Relief was already beginning to wash over him. He would be allowed to leave here alive. With the rotors still running, he quickly had the helicopter back up into the air, though the wind briefly threatened to claim his ride. The pilot expertly regained control and headed off into the sky. It was deemed unsafe for the helicopter to stay here. Not just unsafe for the 2-man crew, but for the rest of the world. Those in charge, the men who made the decision of life and death, had very nearly panicked. Instead of sending the 5-man team, nuclear fire had almost been unleashed against this location. Whatever had broken loose in this secret place couldn't be allowed out into the world, for it threatened to weaken the sanity of anyone who learnt of it. The pilot had been told that much by a superior officer who had needed to get half drunk to process the information passed down to him from the highest level. Banking his helicopter away, the pilot prayed that he could get back to see his children. Sometimes the rumors whispered, these 5 killers cleaned house in its entirety. That included those unfortunate enough to deliver them to their task. 5 men were left deliberately stranded on the helicopter landing pad. If they couldn't complete their task, there would be no rescue for them. They had accepted that as part of the mission. It wasn't like it would be the first time they were placed in such a predicament. The concrete beneath their feet was free from snow as the ground was miraculously warmed by an underground heating system. No expense had been spared on this research facility, the scientists here promising to revolutionize the world. That the activities of these so-called geniuses had now threatened to bring an end to that world should have perhaps been spotted earlier. Why did the eggheads persist in meddling with the unknown? It never ended well. I think they were scared of us, Dmitry Petrov said about the pilots. He was a major by rank, although none of his men called him that. He had the misfortune of being the commanding officer of the most elite unit of the Russian FSB, which meant he was now in this ungodly place. There was nobody else deemed capable of the role. Dmitri had once been asked why he so willingly put himself in harm's way. What else would a man like him do? Spetsnaz, Special Purpose Forces, the best the Russians had. And Dmitri's unit stood head and shoulders above them all. Each individual was handpicked by him, and he would gladly give his pathetic life to save each and every one of them. The loyal followers under him would willingly have said the same. After all, a single life was no great precious thing. Nobody had bothered to tell him why the FSB was even involved in this facility's activities. The only information he had been given was that which was necessary to investigate and clean up this mess. This was a disaster, likely worse than anyone could imagine. How did he know? Because the head of the FSB had told him so. The director had insisted to his face that Dmitri take charge of the matter and that there was nobody else capable of correcting the mistakes the scientists had made. And Dmitri had never seen his boss so visibly engulfed by terror. It had almost been embarrassing to witness. Hardened men who had seen battle should not be afraid like that. "You would think they had somewhere more important to be," Andrei said. "The squad sergeant, a good man to have at your back and a terrible prospect to face in battle. Big, bull-necked, and renowned for enjoying pain both in the receiving and the inflicting." At over 6'3", Andrei was not someone you wanted to piss off. Dmitri had found him languishing in a cell in the Black Dolphin prison, the harshest the Russians had. The crime didn't matter. Only loyalty and skill was of concern to Dmitri, and those traits were something Andrei had in abundance. The major had made the giant an offer that had been gladly accepted. The other 3 men were unpacking the boxes they had brought. Boxes that were filled with the equipment to cover all eventualities. Mon-50 anti-personnel mines. Semtex, enough to bring down the whole mountain if they so desired. 5 Heckler & Koch HK-17s, with enough ammunition to fight a war. 1 KBP GM-94 multi-shot grenade launcher. 5 9mm GDH-18 sidearms, already outfitted, each magazine fitted with armor-piercing ammunition. 4 grenades per man. More than 1 Kisleyer knife each, with a hell of a lot of guts behind them. Each man was also fitted with the latest Ratnik gear protective armor and communication devices. Even deep within the mountain complex they were about to enter, they would be able to keep in contact with each other should they be separated, something Dmitri had already determined would not be happening. When they entered this place, they would stay together. It didn't matter if that meant the operation took longer. The major had seen the videos of what had gone wrong, the recordings of the experiments seen only by a select few. He wanted his men, and himself, to survive this. That was the only thing he really cared about. If only Dmitri could have heard the demonic voice that floated through the facility he was about to enter.
"And what is this? Who comes into my lair? Ah, hard men, warriors sent to test me. How unfortunate for them. How little they know, and how much I would have them know."
Baal breathed in deeply, relishing the air it hadn't tasted in over a millennium. The carcass that it had consumed allowed it to exist in this realm, its only true weakness. Without a body to infest with its essence, it would soon get drawn back to the darkness of the cage, and already he could feel the human he possessed weakening as the flesh began to rot in rejection of the demon that lived within it. Baal would need another body soon. That was how mankind had trapped him all those generations ago. It could not allow such to happen again, for its own sanity was at stake. There was only so long it could live here without a human host, and a new one would be required within hours. And what prospects it now had to choose from. Prime specimens that were almost worthy of the suffering it could give them. Baal had almost been the creator of its own destruction, bloodlust taking it. When it had escaped from the cage, Baal had lost a sense of itself, killing all before it. That mistake would not be made a second time. Whilst its foolishness had allowed it to become trapped in this mountain, it was well aware that the foolishness of mankind would give it another chance. Baal watched and waited for his adversaries to come to him. "Fedor, I need that door open," Dmitri demanded. Dmitri stood behind the kneeling man, watching him work methodically on the door access console. There were very few ways to access the research facility. Despite the armor he wore, the cold bit into Dmitri, the chill almost like an old friend. None of them feared the cold. They were one with it and trained to use it to their advantage. To be warm was to be weak. The lockdown was absolute, Fedor stated by way of explanation. Fedor, a wiry man who could drink anyone under the table, was the IT specialist. Coder, black hat hacker, as well as being one of the best shots in the whole goddamn Russian army. If anyone could bypass the lockdown, it was Fedor. And if not, they would find another way in. Dmitri did not believe in excuses, but he also did not blame those who could not perform the impossible. There was a click, and the huge steel blast door began to open. Everyone backed up. They didn't know what they would find on the other side. The access continued to open on its huge industrial hinge. The door was so thick, it could withstand a direct blast from a 1,000-pound warhead. Built into the side of the mountain, the whole facility was designed to survive the worst of times. In this instance, it was being used to keep things in rather than out, because the worst of times was exactly what Dmitri and his team were heading into. Inside, the lights were still on, which was refreshing. The first thing they saw was the blood trail in the dismembered arm that lay on the floor in the middle of the entryway, the hand still gripping a pistol that had obviously run dry. None of the men reacted to the scene. They had all seen far worse. "I want this done by the numbers," Dmitri ordered. "We go in, find the source, and get what we came for." "And survivors?" The question came from the fourth member of the team. Costa was a man of little humor and even less mercy. During his time in Chechnya, the Chechen rebels came to fear him, nicknaming Costa the Savage to reflect the brutality for which he was renowned. He was also brutally loyal to those who earned such an honor. Every man here was his equal and a brother to him. "There will be no survivors. Extract information if necessary, but we are the only ones leaving here today. Understood?" Dmitri knew his orders would be followed. "Understood," came the chorus response, except for the fifth man, Vadik, who just nodded his acceptance of the rules. Vadik couldn't speak, due to a run-in between his tongue and the knife of a Syrian torturer. The tongue wasn't the only thing that had been removed, but it had been the torturer and the torturer's crew who had ultimately fared worst in that encounter. As always, it was Vadik who entered the facility first. He had a nose for sensing trouble, almost a sixth sense of where the dangers lay. When the other four were through, Fedor closed the door behind them. Whatever was in here, it could not be allowed to roam free into the world. To that end, Dmitri destroyed the door's internal control panel. Now the facility could only be opened from the outside. The first stage of their mission was complete. The 5 men worked their way further into the facility. With the exception of the discarded arm, it was several minutes before they found any evidence of the devastation that had occurred. Vadik raised a fist to warn everyone of the peril he sensed. He was right. Turning the corner in a well-lit and immaculately white corridor, they found 2 bodies scattered across the floor. Both had been soldiers, clearly part of the detail guarding the research here. Andrei knelt down by the remnants, picking a finger up off the floor and sniffing it. Such injuries could normally only be caused by explosives. "I detect no chemical odor from them. There are no signs of burn residue or impact damage, so this was no explosion. To me, it looks as if they were ripped apart from the inside," Andrei added. Standing, with the finger still grasped, he turned to his commander. "Dmitri, what perils have you brought us to?" There was no accusation there, Andrei's sly grin revealing the playful nature of his words. "Demons always have their little tricks," Dmitri reminded him. The next body they found was actually alive. Fedor had needed to use an explosive charge on the door which led into the server room. As the smoke cleared, the whimpering that came from within the room was unmistakable. There were 2 banks of servers, the air conditioning keeping the room just north of freezing. So it was surprising that a survivor would choose this room to hide out in. Despite the blood that caked her face, Dmitri recognized this person. Tatiana Molenchov, second only to the director at this facility. So at least someone had survived, and as the men entered, she descended into hysterics. Dmitri could understand that. The way the 5 of them were dressed did leave them looking particularly menacing. Fedor went straight for the server on the right, whilst Dmitri went for the woman. "Tell me when you find what we came for," Dmitri said to Fedor, who was already connecting his laptop up to the facility's computers. Part of their task here was to retrieve every bit of information held on the experiments that had been performed. The major knelt down by the woman who tried to push herself away from him. "Listen to me," Dmitri commanded. Whilst he didn't shout, his voice held the authority that demanded attention. "Go away," Tatiana insisted. She wouldn't look at Dmitri, her eyes scrunched shut. In the corner of the room, as she was, she tried to make herself as small as possible. Needless to say, Dmitri didn't go away. Instead, he continued to look at the woman who, once upon a time, he might have found attractive. "Listen to me," Dmitri commanded again. This time he reached forward and grabbed her roughly by the chin, pulling her face forward. There was no tenderness there, and no makeup to stain Dmitri's gloved hand. "Open your eyes and listen to me." "No," Tatiana said defiantly. Good, thought Dmitri. He could detect the belligerence there, which meant the fear was weakening. "I am not one to hurt women," Dmitri informed her. "But my friend Andrei? Well, he does not have the best reputation." Andrei now stood behind Dmitri, and Tatiana opened her eyes long enough to witness Andrei leering at her. He even blew her a little kiss. Dmitri didn't know if the shiver that ran through her was due to disgust or the cold that owned the room. "You shouldn't be here," Tatiana insisted. "You have doomed yourselves." "Indeed, but here we are. How are you still alive?" "I ran and hid," she stated. "It does not seem to like the cold." "And now you tell me lies," Dmitri scolded. He could see the lie in her face. Whatever this thing was, it wouldn't have just let her live out of the goodness of its heart. "Boss," Fedor said from behind where Dmitri crouched, "the computer servers have been wiped clean." So that was why this woman was here. This was her doing. "I think so, but it will take time, longer than we have." Fedor didn't need to apologize. "Then why are you wasting it talking to us?" Andrei said dismissively. "Because your mother isn't here to blow me," came Fedor's response. Even Kostya cracked a smile at that one. Dmitri concentrated fully on the woman. She had secrets that he was determined to extract. His threat to unleash Andrei was a very real one. "Why did you wipe the servers?" Dmitri asked her. "I didn't," lied Tatiana. "There are 17 indicators on a woman's body that often indicate they are lying. You just displayed 9 of them." Dmitri didn't know if that was true or not, but it was something he often said when his intuition kicked in. "I will ask you again. Lying a second time will result in severe and prolonged pain." "It made me," Tatiana admitted after much hesitation. "It? You mean the demon? You know of it?" Tatiana seemed astonished. "Why do you think we are here? Does it have a name?" "Baal," Tatiana whispered. Dmitri knew the name. "You have still not told me the why about the servers, though," Dmitri pressed. Why had Baal insisted the servers be wiped, and why was Tatiana still alive? It said it needed its secrets to be kept, Tatiana revealed. Dmitri looked behind him, Fedor catching his eye. Fedor shook his head. Anything on these servers would never be recoverable. This is Russia. There are no secrets from the likes of me, Dmitri said, standing. Bring her. We need to find this facility's director's office. Gladly, Andrei said. The big Russian leaned down and pulled the frightened woman from the floor. The second door they destroyed was via a well-placed boot rather than explosive charges. Still, it showed that nobody had been in here since the madness had enveloped the facility. Director Petrov's office was exactly as Dmitri imagined it to be. It was sparse of anything that reflected a personality, designed for function by a man who likely had no imagination outside his scientific equations. One wall was covered in framed awards and accolades, several pictures of Petrov with the great and the good. There was a single glass-topped desk and a side room with a conference table. Upon entering, Andrei flung Tatiana onto the almost immaculate black leather couch, the only sign of comfort in the entire room. Petrov is not a man to let his brilliance be lost. He will have a backup of his research in here somewhere, Fedor deduced. He sat quickly at the desk, the computer loading up. Silently, Fedor extracted a metallic-looking box from his combat webbing, which he connected up to Petrov's office computer with a USB cable. Fedor called this box the Kraken. It was a portable password cracking device he himself had designed. With the computer loaded up, it took Fedor less than a minute to break into the computer, despite its supposed encryption. They always make it too easy for me, Fedor commented, mainly to himself. Whatever password Petrov had chosen, it wouldn't have met the rigorous standards laid down by FSB protocol. The hard drive is loaded with video files. At a guess, I would say Petrov was keeping an unofficial video journal, Fedor finally said. As I suspected, Dmitri stated before pointing at the screen. Click on the last one. Fedor did as instructed, and voice of Petrov floated into the room. The experiment has taken an unusual turn. Despite all the surviving test subjects being separated, they are all reporting exactly the same level of hallucination. They report that something is trying to break through, that the lack of sleep is leaving them vulnerable to some entity that is calling to them. It is not unheard of for such phenomena to occur, and may well represent the unconscious ID being unlocked and allowed a voice. Petrov paused as he took a sip from a mug, that very mug still standing proudly on the glass-top table in front of Dmitri's crew. They are all insisting they be allowed to sleep, but there is a problem in that regard. As a result of what happened 2 days ago, I ordered Subject 1 be allowed to sleep, under controlled conditions, of course. As soon as REM sleep hit, the test subject known as 1 suffered a fatal heart attack. This is an unfortunate side effect that we hadn't anticipated. It is my conclusion that we take the remaining test subjects to the logical conclusion of where this has to end. The video ended. Bloody idiot, Dmitri said between clenched teeth. I've seen enough. Such a nice place you have here, Tatiana, Andrei said. He stood, towering over their prisoner. It was important work, she insisted, although she didn't sound convinced by her own words. So important you have to torture people? You are a woman after my own heart. Tatiana didn't respond to Andrei's comment. Download all that to FSB Central, Dmitri ordered. They will want to see what happened here. Hopefully, it will make them think twice before authorizing such insanity the next time. If there is a next time, Kostya said. He stood in the doorway, with Vadik still out in the corridor. Dmitri was about to ask what he meant, but then he heard the noise that had sparked Kostya's concern. Somewhere, something was being dragged. Something metal. Like most of the facility, the corridor outside Petrov's office was well lit, with the suspended ceiling sporting an abundance of LED lights. 10 meters along, the corridor curved out of sight, the sound coming from the northern direction. Vadik knelt down with his main weapon aimed, ready for whatever was about to appear. Casting a glance behind him, Kostya leant against the door frame, his gun aimed in the same direction. Nothing approached from the other end of the corridor. A single figure emerged. Evidently, it had once been a scientist. That is, until it had been ruined by the dark forces of Satan. It didn't so much walk as lurch, its right ankle twisted at an obscene angle. One of its arms hung loose, having been dislocated and ripped almost fully from the socket. The other arm dragged a fire axe behind it, not the most formidable weapon for a one-armed man. Only this was no man. Its head was the worst, hanging down to the right with part of the vertebrae actually sticking out from the skin. The mandible was gone, ripped from its home and lost in whatever frenzy had created it. There was still blood in the body, the occasional jet of red liquid firing out of the neck to desecrate the scientific purity of the facility. "Dmitri," Kostya said, "I do not believe you are paying me enough for this." With that, he opened fire at the creature. The bullets, explosive in nature and designed to penetrate body armor, tore great chunks out of the walking dead man's torso, making short work of any threat that was there. Vadik also joined in, his second-to-last bullet ending the thing. The head was severed and it tumbled to the floor, the body not far behind it. "Threat neutralized," Kostya said. "How many people did you say were in this facility?" 48 on record, Dmitri stated. "Fantastic." Kostya looked down at Vadik, who was already reloading his weapon. "Good shot, my friend," Kostya said. Vadik gave a thumbs up, knowing that he would be allowed to add another notch onto his weapon. All the while, a power greater than any of them watched.
How man has changed,
thought Baal. Mankind had been so primitive the last time Baal was here. Now they truly had perfected the art of war. Everything about them was better. So much nutrition to be extracted. Baal had already noticed the lack of superstition in the minds it had interacted with, which had made it difficult to manipulate some of them. Those ones he had been forced to destroy outright, fully extracting their essence. There were advantages this time, though. In the days of the book, Baal had found mankind so plain in its thinking that there had been limitations on what terrors he could create in their minds. Baal's energy was fueled by the fear of those it encountered, their fates determined by the madness that lurked in their own imaginings. Torture, from the very minds of the tortured. It watched these newcomers now, concern rising in it. For some reason they reminded him of the warriors that had cast him out. It had been watching humanity from the confines of its cage, tormented by their burgeoning numbers, forever denied the delights that were so tantalizingly dangled before it. And then the cage had been opened, and the tunnel of light had sucked him into the poor victim's soul. The fun had begun again. It had been summoned before by those with the arcane knowledge. Spells and incantations had been used to control and bind it. Every time, it had been denied its escape, cast back down into the cage where most of its brethren writhed and raged at the possibilities that were denied them. But then one man had used science to bypass the safety checks that the Creator had put in place. It was a mistake, the thoughts and ideas of men going where they were never designed to go, their own curiosity making them gods in their own right. They were young, though, still naive, testing waters they didn't even realize existed. Their science had killed off their belief in an all-powerful Father, and with that loss they had learnt to ignore the warnings that were there in every religion. By their own arrogance, they had set Baal free. And yet they were not completely foolish, for it had still found itself trapped in this mountain facility. These men who had come would be its path to salvation. but they might also be a problem if they were not handled properly. It still craved to be fully unleashed, and it whispered threats and demands into the ears of the ones it kept reanimated. It needed to study these men and choose the one it would make its own. Thus Baal waited for the men to come to him. "No more nonsense," Dmitri insisted. He stood over the woman who looked up at him sheepishly. "Enough of your act. Tell me how many more of you are alive here." "I'm the last," Tatiana said defiantly. "I find that hard to believe. We haven't seen enough bodies," Dmitri revealed. "I mean, there might be some hiding, like I was, but you saw what that thing can do," Tatiana almost begged. "And yet you are still alive. I find this curious." Dmitri removed the gun from its holster, the promised threat very real. "Explain to me what you think is happening here, and make it believable." He didn't point the weapon because he didn't need to. "We unlocked something, an ancient evil," Tatiana stated. "Baal," Andrei said. Tatiana nodded. "That's what it calls itself. I warned the professor that this experiment was dangerous." "And how did you know that?" Dmitri inquired. "My own studies suggested that the director's research was flawed." "What research?" Dmitri ran his finger back and forth across the trigger guard. "Against possession. The human mind is the gateway to accessing other dimensions. My understanding suggested that sleep was the key to keeping that gateway locked." Tatiana sighed as she spoke. Dmitri holstered his weapon, which brought another sigh of relief from Tatiana. The relief was short-lived. There was more firing from outside, which made Tatiana jump. Dmitri barely seemed to react. "So, you believe in demons?" Dmitri commented. It was clear to him now that Tatiana had been kept alive to give Baal something to torment. "Yes, as should you." Dmitri bent down so that his face was close to Tatiana. "Why do you think we are here?" Dmitri stated, placing a restraining hand on his captive's shoulder. Tatiana didn't see the knife, just a brief flash as it caught the light. She barely felt its penetration as Dmitri shoved it up through the sweet spot between her ribs, just under the left breast. A killing blow, slicing open the aorta. Even an experienced team of trauma surgeons would struggle to salvage life with such a wound. Clean as well, most of the blood escaping into the surrounding tissue cavities. Much more pleasant and less messy than taking out the carotid or the femoral artery. 27, Andrei said. The number of times his commanding officer and friend had used this particular method to kill someone. "But why?" Tatiana managed. She was medically trained. She knew what an injury like that would mean to her. Still, there was hardly any pain, just a warmth that spread across her chest. "Orders," Dmitri simply stated. Pulling the knife free, he wiped it on her shoulder. "Your failures here cannot be allowed to infect the world." After that, they went from room to room, killing everyone or everything they could find. Occasionally, they would encounter an intact body, and this was beheaded and burnt so as not to leave any chance for demonic possession. For the most part, Baal had done much of their job for them. This was no great hardship for Dmitri and his men. They had performed these executions 100 times before. It was in the research lab, where the video had been taken, that they found the last survivor. The eyes had the black flecks that floated across the whites, which was a pretty good clue something was amiss. That, and the fact that the naked body they were now faced with was floating 2 feet off the ground. The muscles of the levitating body seemed to ripple, as if some invisible force was massaging them.
"You have come,"
Baal said. It sounded satisfied. It looked out at the men as they spread out around the edges of the room, such an array of flesh for it to choose from. "Time for you to go back in your cage, Baal," Dmitri stated calmly. He didn't have to order his men to open fire. They did what they were trained to do. The floating body bucked and flopped as the bullet struck it. The flesh shredded faster than it could reform itself. Demons had the ability to repair their damaged hosts, but only to a degree. Even a king of hell couldn't withstand what they threw at Baal.
Fools!
Baal mocked in a voice that resonated around the room.
You cannot kill what does not live.
No, but we can send you back to hell where you belong, Costa shouted. Despite its certainty, there was confusion in the mind of Baal.
Why are these men not afraid?
Dmitri swapped out a magazine, emptying more explosive rounds into the body that was now starting to descend. They always came to Earth eventually, their power weakening as the onslaught sapped them. Finally, Baal's host was on its knees, the time of abandonment close. The men stopped firing.
Any one of you will be ripe for me,
Baal threatened. One by one he would possess them and turn their guns on each other. You aren't going to get the result you expect here, Baal, Dmitri advised. Having fought demons before, he knew how advantageous it was to be in an isolated location such as this. They had once faced off against a lesser demon that had managed to possess a schoolteacher in Akinsk. They had managed to cover that up, but only just. The loss of life had been astronomical.
This flesh is but a tool. Yours will do just as well.
I'm right here, Baal. Already Dmitri could feel the demon trying to prise its way into his body. It felt like someone was kneading his scalp, and the air around him suddenly filled with the smell of sulfur. What's the matter?
I can't.
The host body was getting weaker, the wounds opening up again. One of its arms dropped to the floor, the face barely recognizable as such. Still, the lips moved. You see, Baal, we thought the word had got around down there. Earth is closed to scum like you. Obviously you haven't been paying attention. Dmitri smiled as he spoke.
No.
Baal roared, the air in the room shaking with demonic fury.
I will have you. I will have you all.
No, you won't. Dmitri felt the presence pushing again. Harder now, desperate even. You're running out of time, Baal.
How? How can this be?
I think you know, Dmitri stated. The flesh on the host began to melt. It would be now or never for Baal, its body no longer able to sustain a presence. Forced to leave, it would become violent in its desperation, but nothing Dmitri and his men couldn't weather. You have no power here, not over us.
This cannot be.
Baal roared with its last human words. As it left the body, the host completely liquefied, spreading out across the already soiled floor. In his mind, Dmitri heard the ethereal scream as Baal realized that he was lost.
You have no soul.
No soul. Without a soul, the bodies were just meat, useless to those who wished to take control of them. Without a soul, Baal's psychic attacks would also be for nothing. Finally, you noticed.
But how?
Baal was fading, the black smoke of his essence dissipating as hell began to reclaim its property. The wonders of science, Andrei stated. I can't say I miss it. In 1907, the American physician Duncan McDougall performed research that seemed to show the soul had a weight, 21 grams in all. Widely derided, those experiments were still repeated by Russian scientists decades later. In a facility not unlike the one in which Dmitri now stood, a means to extract the soul was found. Dmitri and men like him, broken by battle and ruined by post-traumatic stress disorder, were given a choice. Be free of the pain, the guilt, and doubt. Live a life for the state and for humanity. Work as troubleshooters, to be sent into places normal men dare not go. Given special status and almost free reign, they worked for the greater good of humanity. Dmitri had accepted the offer gladly, So had the men now with him. With God now long dead, they were the occasional guardians over the pits of hell that every day waited to wreak havoc on the realm they coveted. Baal, as powerful as it was, had met its match. As the last of its form evaporated, Dmitri stepped forward and spat on the now bubbling body. Even the bones had started to melt. Those damned demons were always finding a way to prise the lid off their fetid box, but Dmitri had pledged to be there to stuff them right back where they belonged.